Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Time Extend. My name is Adam Ismail, and as always, today I am joined by
Brendan Rodison, and well, Adam, we go from our last episode where we're talking about one of the biggest racers ever to release, right in the mainstream public eye, something that people can't stop talking about, whether it be due to Game Awards snubs or just in general being one of the highest rated racing games of all time. We're moving from a topic like that in the last episode to the game this episode, Racing Lagoon, which it couldn't be further away from Forza Horizon, could it?
You know, you say that, but a lot of people kind of want Forza Horizon to do something crazy like this and kind of focus on, Japan and street racing and the culture over there from the 90s. So in many ways, this is the I don't want to say it's like the prototypical like version of like the Forza Horizon, but it is like one of the sort of prototypes for like a open world street racer, the kind that we get later on, except of course this one is really a full-on RPG in every sense of the word. There are the car PGs, like your Forzas and your Gran Turismos, and there's, Midnight Club or whatever open world Need for Speed you have that has some semblance of a story, but no game quite hits the JRPG beats in the way that Racing Lagoon does, while still providing something, not a full open world, because of course this was a PlayStation game, but having that kind of hub world and the process of equipping parts of your car and everything, kind of having more of like an items in an RPG or in Final Fantasy type process to it. This game is the purest expression of the combination of like those two worlds I think that there has ever been, and it's only right and it's only suitable that the company that made it was of course Squaresoft.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, my God, just to kind of get into it a little bit, the general vibe of this game, you can absolutely tell it's a 90s Squaresoft game. It just absolutely drips with that kind of type of style in terms of the game setup and the way the characters are designed and the like. You can definitely see how this could have been on the same shelves as things like Final Fantasy VII at the time.
Yeah, and what I love about it is, it's a kind of risk-taking that we just do not see in this genre anymore at all. You have, Squaresoft, who are, of course, a titan of their genre and probably the most preeminent, JRPG developer, especially, in the 90s, of course, there were so many different companies that were working on games along the Final Fantasy realm, and, we're not experts in that field. I won't pretend to be, but, like, in terms of like developers and publishers that were like at their absolute zenith in like the late 90s, the PS1 days, Squaresoft is one of them. The PlayStation 1 basically sold off the promise of being the next destination for the Final Fantasy franchise. So they are just absolutely at the top of their game. I guess the closest thing that we could liken them to for people who maybe like us have less experience with that genre, but of course know about arcade games and racing, is they were kind of like the Namco of their craft. Like Namco was like, or like Sega, these were companies that were really like hitting, just going from strength to strength, and Squaresoft was one of them. So you take that sort of ambition and you combine it with this racing game, and Racing Lagoon, it only came out in Japan, as I'm sure anyone who's listening to this who has any background about the game knows that it's some weird, quirky game from Japan that never made it quite here, that has a ridiculous story, and that's kind of all just like table stakes. Everybody knows that. Came out in 1999. But, when you think about contextually speaking, this game pretty much only lagged behind Gran Turismo by like a year, if you take that by like the Western release of Gran Turismo. So, GT redefines the genre, and then already within the space of a couple of months, and R4 was kind of around this time too, you're getting these games that are just kind of laser focus on the racing genre, but doing so many different interesting things with it, narratively speaking, and it is exactly the kind of stuff that we love on this show, to put it as succinctly as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what we say we like in a racing game a lot of the time is when there is a semblance of focus there and an ability to capture even the most intricate of details for what experience it's trying to offer. And that is like what makes Racing Lagoon so much fun, because the elements it focuses on are definitely bits that you may have seen dabbled in throughout the genre later on, for example, through the various street racing games that would follow and the attempt at capturing that type of atmosphere. And then, like we're saying on the RPG side of things, we see the idea of upgrading cars through Gran Turismo and the like. But neither of these type of the plethora of street racing games or the way Gran Turismo approaches it kind of fall in line with what Racing Lagoon tries to do, which is actually encourage that type of JRPG-like thinking where it's not so much about the on-track action. Well, it is about the on-track action, but it's not just the main focus here. That main focus is really on how you actually kind of build and work with your cars, the type of battles that you kind of get involved in. We've got random encounters here as well in terms of the overworld and such. It really does kind of tick those boxes that we look for in Time Extend, and it's crazy to me because often when somebody tells you to go back and play a PlayStation 1 game or something from that era, you expect to find it at least a bit of a clunky experience in many ways. But like I'm a JRPG fan myself, Adam, so it's one of these things where going back and playing these older types of experiences in this type of genre has never really bothered me that much. And Racing Lagoon just ticked all the right boxes for me across those two genres. Like, I did find myself really enjoying what this game had to offer, because it took those kind of staples of JRPG gameplay, but put it in a racing game in a way that didn't feel shoehorned in or done just for the sake of it. It does feel as if there's a lot of love and craft here, and that stretches not just into the environments here and the scenarios that you race in, but like we're saying, the gameplay side of things as well, all ties together nicely in a package that we can't help but love.
Sorry, I didn't mean to speak for you when I said that, we are both not JRPG fans.
That's all good, mate. It's all good. You might not think I'd be a JRPG fan, to be honest. I totally get that.
The only one I've ever really sunk time into, well, that's not true. 2 games, one being Final Fantasy 13, and the other one being Earthbound. Earthbound, being the JRPG that tries to not be a JRPG. And then in some weird backwards way ends up becoming the most JRPG of them all.
Yeah, it's one of these weird things where I've never actually been a huge fan of like Final Fantasy and such, the bigger ones like Dragon Quest and the like, but there are specific series that kind of tick the boxes for me, not too dissimilar to the way we talk about racing games, and the kind of concepts within Racing Lagoon definitely tie into those types of games. And I think that's why right away I was kind of grabbed by this, because as I'm sure we'll go into, the way that this game approaches the idea of becoming a racing legend, so to speak, is pretty cool. The way that you build your cars up, the way that you're able to kind of take on people in the overworld, there are just a lot of elements here that we don't really see that much or at all elsewhere.
It is such a clever game mechanically, and I think that's what I keep coming back to is the closest thing I could compare Racing Lagoon to is we did an episode on Tokyo Extreme Racer a while back, and it's basically like if you took TXR, and TXR likes to do this thing where it hints at the story, but you would really only ever know kind of the cascade and the chronology of events if you like beat a rival in the game and then go back to your garage and then go through like 5 menus, click on their name and read about them. Like, that's the only way that you would ever know that there's a story that kind of links the factions in TXR together. Picture that, but then, basically brought front and center from the background to the foreground in the way that you can't ignore it. It's there. It is actively a part of the game. It's more of a part of a game really than the driving, as you kind of alluded to. And that's basically what you have in Racing Lagoon. And the thing is, like, a lot of people are going to be playing this for the first time now, because it's kind of interesting that we've been talking about this for 10 minutes and we haven't yet talked about the fact that this game has had a fantastic fan translation done by a group of people with an individual by the name of Hilltop kind of overseeing all of it. And that patch has been published online. You can get it. There are a number of people in this community who are going through it for the first time. I didn't know Racing Lagoon even existed honestly, until like 2015, which is kind of crazy in of itself to me, because like growing up, like thinking I know everything about every racing game and I've played every single one, but like, or at least I have an awareness that it exists, but like Racing Lagoon completely dodged me, being a Japanese only release.
Yep.
And now for a game like this to be able, that anyone can enjoy it, and for it to have been translated into English with the love and care that whole team has done, is really fantastic. And if you want to know more about that, there's a great article on PC Gamer that was written by Wes Fenlon, where he talks to some people, including Hilltop from the effort, that kind of shine some light on how they got through this entire translation patch effort in like 6 months, which is incredible. So all of that is to say that the time is right to talk about this game, and we haven't, for a while, because we didn't have that piece we needed to understand the story and be able to actually like play through the game. There's like an arcade battle type mode, but that is 10% of what Racing Lagoon is at the end of the day, because that just relegates the game to these very short races. And as we'll talk about, this kind of does the R4 thing in as much as like it's not about the racing. And that's I think pretty clear from the moment you start playing the game, and you kind of realize that like all of the races are kind of short. The introduction is, it's probably like 15, it feels like it's 10 or 15 minutes before you actually do anything in the game, which is fine because, it's a JRPG, and that's the kind of experience it is. But with all that said, I guess it'd be good to probably set up contextually what the game is about, and then we can maybe get into some of the development history. So, as far as the story is concerned, it starts out in a pretty, and we won't go fully into it because we don't want to reveal everything because people are playing it for the first time. But it starts out in a pretty conventional way in that you're kind of a newcomer to this kind of club, the Bay Lagoon Racers. And no one quite knows who you are, and you very quickly get the sense that like you don't even know who you are. Your name is Sho Akasaki, and it's just the back and forth rivalry at first between them and the Honmuku Night Racers, I believe is the name of that team.
Yeah.
And very slowly they kind of start to peel back the layers, and there's a lot of philosophical talk about legends, and the character doesn't really remember who he is, and there's like a seedy past, and we won't get into all of that, but it sets itself up in the way where you're going to have very ridiculous like JRPG fare of just like the directions that the story goes in. You can't, if you're going off the mindset of this is a racing game, it's going to absolutely blow you away. If you thought like our Racing Evolution story was like weird, this one goes in a completely different direction, and it almost kind of feels like Resident Evil-y at a certain point.
Yeah, there's definitely a very odd tone to the full game that you do end up kind of appreciating and really liking, because I think it's referred to as Lagoon Go, I think it is basically like the accent that the English or the translated English is written in, for example, is this kind of poetic speech pattern that's used throughout to kind of capture what these philosophical elements are. And it's one of these things where if you don't know any of that, like me, when you first boot up this game, and you just see some of these sentences flashing up on the screen, and the way like some of the kind of typefaced elements come up on the display and everything, it's very much an experience that has to be seen to be believed, because some of the dialogue here is absolutely hilarious, and I know there was a bit of creative freedom used as well by the fan translation team, but from what I've seen and what they've kind of said in various interviews, it's still definitely in line with what the kind of original Japanese was as well.
Yeah, the thing is, if you're playing this for the first time and you're an English speaker and you don't you're going through the translation, I think it's important to point out that like you might be like reading some of this text, reading this dialogue and thinking like, wow, the people who are in charge of the translation really just like they just like injected so much personality into it. They said all these weird things, they added all the, like, and you might be like skeptical, like, is this really what the game is about? No, like that weirdness, that strangeness, that overly philosophical nature of like the dialogue and the things that just pop up on the screen as you're like watching a replay. You'll just see like this internal monologue that like Sho is having with himself. Like, I can hear the hush of the wind, the hum of the engine. Like all of these like random things will just show up. That's all in the game, like that, like, and like these weird like turns of phrase and like these just weird, expressions. It's, as I understand it from the people who worked on the translation, like they're weird to Japanese speakers too. So like it's just in general, like it's one of those things that like if you feel like you're missing out on something because you're not able to understand the Japanese pretense of everything, like just know that like even if you are fluent in the language and understand the culture, it's still weird. And I think there's something delightful to that. That kind of adds to the game's like mystery and legend.
Yeah, exactly. That's it. It definitely does leave an impression right from the off, and I think that's important because especially now where we're so indoctrinated to the idea of street racing and what that culture's supposed to be, it's so interesting just seeing what would have been pretty much a completely fresh take in the video game side of things with street racing that goes down a totally different path to how it would be interpreted in the West through games like Need for Speed and stuff. It's and even Tokyo Extreme Racer, by contrast, like that uses the idea of almost like kind of god or boss or idol cars to kind of embellish that atmosphere and add the racing teams and such, but Racing Lagoon goes down the different angle of just like totally embracing the idea of craziness here, and the fact that it is very much a role-playing game. It really embraces that, and what it means is you get, like you're saying, these kind of tons of phrase and everything that appear on the screen. It's all very Racing Lagoon, and it feels weird saying that for a game I didn't even know existed until a few years ago, but I just couldn't imagine any other title or any other series trying to be as bold as this game is, because it was coming into this type of atmosphere completely fresh. You'd imagine they obviously tried their best to kind of capture what they understood about the Japanese street racing culture as well. Of course, all that effort probably went into it, I imagine. It's just, from somebody who's a total outsider to this game before playing it, it just leaves an impact instantly, and it's just part of the fun and reason you should play this game. It's not even about the actual experience of playing it as a game, it's experiencing the kind of motifs that are here and the general atmosphere, which for me you just won't find anywhere else.
Yeah, this is really going to surprise you. If you feel like you're just kind of tired of everything and you want to just see a racing game just come out of nowhere and hit you with these like this very strange atmosphere that's also very cool, amazing soundtrack, which I feel like the first thing you hear about Racing Lagoon these days even is just like how fantastic the soundtrack is. And like since I started playing the game, I've started hearing more of the soundtrack, and like I've sprinkled a couple songs in Time Extend episodes in the past, but like now I'm really listening to it, and it's phenomenal. This game it's really appropriate that the fan translation came out now, because I also feel like this aesthetic, this idea is so fashionable again. maybe in the late 90s, that wasn't really a beat that like we were picking up on in the West. And then like street racing culture kind of broke through in the 2000s, but it was more of like a Fast and Furious, like street racing syndicate, like you're in Los Angeles, like not like this. But now like, JDM cars from the 90s are like the coolest thing in the world again. And JRPGs and Final Fantasy is still relevant. And especially with games like, Final Fantasy VII Remake coming out, like Square is still kind of put their stamp on everything. And so it's really great that this game is finally getting the respect that it deserved, because, when it came out, it was actually, it didn't sell very well, and it wasn't even critically very popular. Famitsu scored it a 21 out of 40. One of the Famitsus, apparently, because I didn't even realize there were multiple Famitsu publications, but there was like, they have their 40 out of 40 scale, as a lot of people know. And one time they scored a 21, another time they were a little bit more favorable and they gave it a 26. These are pretty critical, perceptions of a game that really tried to do something new and fresh. And maybe at the time it was just kind of seen as like, well, if I want to play an RPG, I'll play Final Fantasy VII. And if I want to play a good racing game, I'll play Gran Turismo. And I don't really need these two things to ever cross paths. But these days, like, I think there's a real desire to get back to that. I think there's a desire to see chances taken again. Because you have to figure in the late 90s, like a game like Gran Turismo was so new that just that concept alone of a game that took modifying, upgrading cars that seriously, and with that kind of realism and that focus, that was just that world in and of itself was something that people wanted to live in. Less so the kind of hyper visual, hyper artistic sort of takes on the racing game formula that we saw from Namco and obviously Squaresoft. I think it's really not a coincidence at the end of the day that like Racing Lagoon and R4 and Wipeout 3, a lot of really sort of avant-garde racing games sort of came out at the exact same time on the same system, give or take within a couple of months of each other. I came across a quote from Hilltop saying that like, Square is so famously like not aware that this game has not like brought this game up in so many years that like he's not even worried that like the translation would ever get taken down or legal action will be taken, because Square is just so has like washed their hands of it completely. But maybe my hope is that something like this coming up again will sort of prove that being sort of the talk of the town and everything will sort of prove that there's a market for these things. That's really deep down the sort of desperate hope that I have.
Yeah, I think that kind of sums up nicely why I think there has been a clamour to support this translation as well and try and amplify its reach, because I think just now everybody feels that gaming is maybe playing it too safe in many regards, that we understand what is popular and what sells and what doesn't, and that applies to the racing genre specifically as well. We see a lot of the kind of arcade racing games, for example, that we have nowadays still fit into very distinct specific criteria. You don't really see as much risks as would have been taken before, and maybe that is a parallel to when this came out, and it's very easy to make a statement like, oh, if I wanted a racing game I'd play Gran Turismo, and if I wanted an RPG I'd play Final Fantasy. But funnily enough, I think that type of thinking is what kind of stagnates any genre. So it's a shame that Racing Lagoon did so bad, and it's one of these situations as well where I think like Famitsu are kind of popular for giving, or infamous you could say, for giving kind of pretty high scores to Japanese developed games. So the fact that it scored so low as well is a bit of a surprise to me, given that there's something that's really cool here. And you know what, like maybe you could say that it falls into the JRPG tropes too much, but I'm saying that from a 2021 mindset at the end of the day. Like I really doubt in the kind of the late 90s when this launched everybody was already bored of that concept. Far from it. It's pretty much kind of Squaresoft mania, wasn't it? So it is interesting to see why it would score so low, and maybe it is just that idea where making a compelling racing-based story is obviously difficult. There's a handful that do it well, if that, across any medium. And to be honest, I would say that from my perspective, Racing Lagoon story is strong because it embraces the kind of cookie culture that it creates, and it does so stylishly. Like, obviously, we've talked about the design elements of the game a lot, but even just if kind of touching upon how you actually upgrade the cars and stuff, the way that the game handles that, and I'm not sure if that's something we want to kind of touch on now, Adam, or get to later, but yeah, I mean, that's something that just, it shines so brightly amongst other games that just don't have anything like this type of system.
Yeah, so I mean, we may as well get into it now, because I feel like this game is so big that where this discussion is just like trailing off in like 40 different ways, which I feel like, you know, on one hand is sort of disorganized, but on the other, like, anyone who is playing this for the first time, as we are, it's such a grandiose concept, this game, and it's really hard to just like succinctly describe. So, yeah, you know, I think it'd be good to sort of focus on more specifics. And Brendan, one of the first things actually I said to you, because I started playing this game I think a day or two before you did, and I was like, I really think you need to check it out. We need to talk about it. And I think the thing I called out was the whole get reward system, which I know will sound like gibberish to anyone who hasn't played the game yet, but that's what I felt immediately off the line. I was like, this is just a brilliant game design that I have not seen from anything before. So we're used to, in like these sort of street racing games, maybe this concept of like pink slips, where you beat someone, you get their car. There's not a lot of strategy in that. It sort of is a good way to punctuate important moments of the story, but the way that Racing Lagoon does it's a bit different. Any rival that you beat, and this is true of like random encounters on the street or like big pivotal story races, anyone you beat, you get to take a part from their car. And likewise, if someone beats you, they can take a part from your car. And what's interesting about it, and this might, if you tried to think of this system in a conventional racing game, you'd be like, oh, it would never work. Because, like, let's say you're in a Supra and I'm in a Skyline, and I beat you and I take like a Supra, I don't know, like a Supra body kit. Like, what would I do with that with my Skyline? But the way that Square went about it, and the way the Racing Lagoon goes about it, is like it just kind of fudges things enough so that they work really well from a game design standpoint, even if they don't make sense. So for example, like if you beat somebody, if that same exact encounter happens, like let's say you were in the Supra and I beat you, I could take your exhaust, which will work. Any of the parts will work on my car. I could take your exhaust, which will work on my car. I could take your suspension. I could take your tires. And there's a bunch of different types of parts, and they all have performance costs and benefits. I could take your body kit, and it might be called like a GT body kit, and I could apply that to my Skyline, where it will be a completely different body kit made for the Skyline. So you have these like upgrades that you can universally apply to anything, will kind of do different things for different vehicles. But what it gets really crazy with is it's almost like a automotive Ship of Theseus thing, because like if you started with a Skyline, you know, and for whatever reason you were like, I want to put an AA6 Corolla body on it, and I want the drivetrain from like a Subaru WRX, and I want to put like, you know, a 3S GTE engine in it. Like, you could do that. You could make a Frankenstein vehicle that cobbles together parts from all different other kinds of vehicles and make it your own. And that is just such an awesome idea that is completely impossible if you were ever going to try and make sense of it in terms of licensing, which is why this game has cars that look real, but they are not officially licensed. They have fake dummy names in the same tradition that, like, say, TXR does. So you can never do it with licensing. It would be an absolute nightmare. No one would allow it. But, you know, at the time this game came out, it was something that Square could get away with. and it uses it to brilliant effect. And it's just so cool to be able to make a car that is uniquely yours. It's so cool to take something like a Civic and make it mid-engined, which then also just like completely redoes the bodywork. So now it's like cab forward, and it has like all of these vents like where the back was, and it looks like a coupe. Like, it's really hard to explain. There are great videos online, one done by RX Chris, who's, you know, our beloved moderator, one of our beloved moderators on the Time Extend Discord, and he did this video years back where he's just like going through the ridiculous like body kits in the game. That to me is like one of the most brilliant things I've seen from a racing game in quite a long time.
And it's another case where we add a tick beside why games should consider using unlicensed cars if they want to try some crazy concepts in their racing games, because some of the kind of combinations you can make are absolutely crazy. And the thing I like about the game is that just taking apart and applying it to your car does not necessarily make the car better as well. Mm-hmm. Like, if you do make some changes, they might have undesirable effects, and they might really hinder your driving style. And the cool thing is there is a bit of experimentation in there. You always have to kind of be crucial about what parts you pick, and like that can be, for example, if you beat a car that has a particularly good part on a certain part, one of the certain parts you can take is particularly good from a performance perspective, but you know there's a slight upgrade that you require for another part of the car, and it has that as well. That idea that you have to almost kind of gamble that you won't get that incredibly powerful part later down the line that you might need then, and you have to settle for a smaller upgrade for now, those type of things actually make the game a lot more fun as well, because picking and choosing parts is a pretty crucial part of the game. And sometimes you just want to make your car look ridiculous with these body kits as well, so it's pretty funny when you kind of go on a spree of just taking as much aero parts and body kit parts as you can just to basically make your car look crazy. And for me, it's one of these things where the game has such freedom, and yet you never feel as if you're kind of breaking the game in a way that makes it unchallenging, or you never feel like it becomes a grind. Obviously, this game is kind of basically, it relies a lot on random encounters in the overworld, just for kind of context for everybody, and it's one of these things that's very divisive nowadays. I think especially in 2021 people aren't a big fan of the random encounters thing, but it was definitely a huge deal in the 90s, and a lot of games relied on that. Here it's great because you'll just kind of be cruising about the overworld and you'll get interrupted to do a race, and much like, I suppose, something like kind of a monster catching game or something, or like Pokemon or the likes, when you get to go into that race, you're kind of already eyeing up what you're actually racing, like, oh, what have we got here? You're kind of able to identify where its strengths are, that type of thing, so that you have that anticipation of what's interrupted your gameplay session, as opposed to just being like, oh fuck's sake, gotta beat somebody again. It's good because it keeps it fresh in a way that you never know what type of parts are going to appear, and there are definitely ones in here that are better than others. So I think that idea that you're basically breaking the car up to, what is it, 3 or 4 main components, isn't it? In terms of what
so there's like chassis, there's body, and there's engine, I think. And
yeah, that rings a bell.
I mean, even like, for example, like one of the body components is paint. So, like, you can actually take the paint from another car. Like, it makes no sense, but I think that's why it works so well, is because they were like, let's not get so bogged down in, like, you know, the logistics of this. It is very logically, like, it's very well designed, but, like, let's not get bogged down in how realistic any of this is, and let's just treat it like just gamify the hell out of it. And the fact that, like, every part has a currency cost to it. Basically, if you beat someone, you can pretty much take any part on their car. However, there's certain, like, every car has its own cost, and there are 2 currencies in the game, one of which is called RP. So you get RP by, like, beating people in battles and things like that and winning races, but you will then spend that RP to get someone's part off of their car. And that kind of does sort of make you, as you were saying, Brendan, strategize, like, okay, you know, should I take this guy's engine? Because it would basically be all of the money I have in my pocket right now. Or, you know, should I try and build up small in other ways? And I think a lot of people like to say like, oh, Gran Turismo was, the first game, or was great, and Forza for the same reason, that you could like take, a Civic and then like make it go up against or make it beat like a Dodge Viper. But to be honest, you never really could do that. I mean, you could make a car way better than you started with, but you would always hit a certain point where it was like, this Civic is never going to beat like a R33 or something, and I have to move on. That's not that is definitely not an issue in Racing Lagoon. You can put anything in anything, and you can make any car 4-wheel drive. You can make any car. I think there's even like a rear engine option, because of all of like the 40 unlicensed cars in this game, one of them is actually a 911, which by the way has a great name. It is just called the Germany RS.
Fantastic.
But yeah, it's just it's delightful, and it is, maybe it's hard to say that I could love anything more about this game than its soundtrack, because the soundtrack is that good. But if I had to focus on an actual aspect of like the gameplay itself, the whole get reward system is just the type of thing that you just never see. And I would love for it to be reapproached in this genre again.
I just love the disrespect of it as well. Like, it's one thing winning somebody's car in a pink slip, but literally just saying, I'm taking your gold paint, and there's nothing you can do about it.
There's nothing you can do about it.
I love like the idea of that dystopian like world where you lose an event and somebody can just take any part of your car. Like, imagine you had like fucking brilliant alloys or something, and you're just like, I'm taking those BBSs, mate, and I'm out of here. You just like left the guy on the side of the road with his car, his tires, but you've taken the rims off of him. It's something I'd love to see actually animated, the idea of how that even works. But like you say, that's how the game works, because it acknowledges that there's no realistic, logical way to depict how this system's even possible, but because it improves the gameplay so much and adds so much, I'm so glad it's here. And you know what, I wish more games would just have that type of idea where it's like, who cares how feasible it is, this is how we're implementing it. And in our world, you can turn any car into any type of drivetrain you want. You can steal individual parts from somebody's car and not have to worry about it. It's that's Lagoon Bay. That's it. I mean, and I think the game alludes to it as much in the kind of dialogue when it's showing you the city for the first time. It talks about the fact that how mysterious the place is and it has its own rules. You know, that's some Twilight Zone shit, and I fucking love it.
Yeah, the first screen I think is the city that forgot what sleep is, Neo Seaside City Bay Lagoon, and that's not translated. Like, that's baked into the FMV right when you start the game.
Yeah.
The whole UI too. I feel like people really focus on the music, the audio presentation of the game, but if you think that Evangelion is a work of art, you're gonna love the menus in Racing Lagoon. It's just purple and orange all the time, huge aerial text. There's all this frivolous shit on the side of the screen, like vertically, that says like, welcome to HSD RPG Car Battle in Yokohama 1999, like just random crap. It's a lot like the gibberish that was on like some of the event cards in like Gran Turismo 3 that you then enhance over the years with like better quality, and you read and it just makes no sense. It's great stuff like that, and it all looks amazing together with the soundtrack. It just fits so well, and it's beautiful. Everything about this game is just really. Even if it's very ham-fisted, and even if like this game has kind of a, as I understand it, like sort of a reputation in Japan for being ridiculous, it's just gorgeous. Like when you see like the overworld for the first time, and this very, very low poly, but still 3D modeled Yokohama or Bay Lagoon from the sky, like. Everything's really tiny. It's kind of like a diorama, like a tilt shift kind of miniatures of everything. And it's just really, it's cute, but it's also beautiful. And, you'll see these little cars driving around. They're made of like 5 pixels. And it all works out way better than it has any right to. A modern open world racing game would say, fuck this kind of 3D from above miniature low poly overworld. We'll just actually have you drive in the world. And I guess, like, objectively speaking, that is a more immersive way to experience a game like this. But there's just something sort of there's something wrong, but also like just beautiful about viewing the city from this way and like controlling how you move through it from this overhead view. I think is like, you know, it's not something anyone would do today except for maybe an indie, but it works very, very well for Racing Lagoon.
I think the interesting part is that the overworld is serving its purpose as a hub for where the game takes place, in a way of driving random encounters and such, and the way that its designs encourages that. To kind of draw parallels to modern open world games, I suppose the difference is Racing Lagoon is absolutely fine to admit that its its hub world exists to justify the gameplay mechanics within, and that's it. Whereas I think nowadays with open worlds, that is kind of sacrilege to say that. Every open world has to be immersive and provide infinite game opportunities and stuff, gameplay opportunities and the likes, whereas, let's be honest, for some open world racing games we've played and in other genres, there are definitely cases where you've probably said, this probably didn't have to be an open world, or this being an open world has kind of diluted the experience. And I think that's the cool thing about Racing Lagoon, where this kind of hub world design means that you still get to see Lagoon Bay in its glory from this kind of diorama like viewing experience, but it doesn't hinder the core gameplay mechanics and keep things moving along very briskly, because I think we were kind of saying just before recording, Adam, like, this isn't a long game by any means, but the impression that it leaves would have just been bogged down, ironically, I suppose, with a kind of traditional open world racing game environment. And I think that the cool thing about Racing Lagoon is I've been kind of thinking recently about how much do we actually need, like, remasters and recreations of games or remakes even, when if you take what Racing Lagoon has now and you try to kind of apply modern principles on top of it, it would probably end up diluting the experience instead of making it better. And I think that's what's really cool about this game. You can come into it in 2021 and have a fantastic experience where you don't feel as if there's any kind of predetermined gripes about it being an old game that annoy you, because it just embellishes everything it tries to offer. And you know what? I think that's incredibly impressive, even if it wasn't appreciated at the time. The fact that you can come into a game that's this old and this type of gaming period where everything is more different than ever and still have a fantastic time, I think that's a credit to the team, and then of course the English translation team as well, who've managed to capture the vibe of that perfectly.
Yeah, and with all of that said, you know, I think we should touch on like how the races in this game actually play out, because, you know, it as was customary at the time, you know, this isn't a truly, you know, open world experience as you would think about it. It's not like you can seamlessly go from like driving in the overworld to like going into a race. You know, basically you traverse this world and you'll have a random encounter or you'll have a story race, and at that moment there are essentially, you know, I haven't worked out how many tracks there are in the game, but let's say there are like 10 or 11 different like very short tracks. Like these, some of them are a little bit longer and they're more circuit based, but there are also a lot of like really, really short ones that are like honestly only like 3 or 4 corners. Stuff that, to be honest, isn't that different from like, remember those like rival races and shocks where you have like, you know, a third of a track that you have to get through before the other guy does. You'll have these tracks that are kind of anchored to certain parts of the world. So there's one for, you know, Chinatown, and there's one for over by the graveyard, and you know they're anchored in different parts of this overworld, and they're really small. And when you, most of them are, when you go to do a race there, you know, you'll have, it might be point to point, it might be 2 or 3 laps, and sometimes it's like 1v1, you just gotta beat the other guy. Sometimes it's your crew going up against their crew. And then once the race is over, you have the get reward system. You go through all of that and you're back into the overworld. As far as the racing itself is concerned, well, you know what, the track design is probably good to talk about, because that I would say is probably the game's biggest weakness. it's very this game kind of suffers from, I guess, like TXR syndrome, in as much as like, especially when you're playing it on like an emulator, you're playing it like at like on a good display now. You maybe wouldn't have noticed as much back in the day on like a CRT, but like the tracks are very simple. You know that from the map, but also like there's not a whole lot modeled. You'll have like the street and you'll have like some buildings, and then you'll have a very high wall that if you ever saw the other side of the wall, there's absolutely nothing there. The tracks are very basic, and you know that's fine for like a PlayStation game. The game still looks glorious because it does that kind of, similar to TXR, it does that thing where clearly Square spent the bulk of the polygon budget on just these beautiful low poly car models. The car models in this great game look excellent, and in that sense, it does kind of feel, it's a very pretty game. Not as technically as impressive as say R4, because like I think R4, maybe, and definitely Gran Turismo maybe push the system more with these sort of, especially in R4's case, much more like lush environments, and they do a better job of like sort of hiding where the world sort of ends. But that's the thing about Racing Lagoon is like, and I think that's why we keep going back to saying like it's not really about the actual like gameplay itself, because like if you were to strip away everything that we've talked about and just like boil it down to, racing on these streets, on these like small snippets of road, you're going to get an experience that isn't incredibly engaging. The handling, I think, is actually pretty solid. I actually don't really mind the handling at all. The collision detection is very punishing. But the tracks themselves don't leave a whole lot to really sink your teeth into in terms of being fun to navigate. And the AI, it's classic, old racing game AI. Somebody's going to shoot way in front of you and you'll spend most of the race trying to catch them. And then once you do, it's basically over.
Yeah, exactly, and I think that's the kind of crux of the game in a way, where you're not going to get any incredibly great racing experiences here because of those kind of tropes that it plays into. And truth be told, on the track there were times when I felt as if I had a good grasp on the car and understand how things were going, but then there seems to be that kind of quirk to the handling as well, where sometimes the acceleration maybe seemed a bit, depending on the parts you're using, of course, but with the build I was using, I often felt like I had full control of the car, and then around corners especially, it almost felt as if the car was on like a kind of a railroad track, but it was kind of coming off slightly as well, so yeah. I was sort of losing control of the car through the corners, but I still had almost too much control, which would lead to crashes and stuff. But that's the type of thing where it comes down to the person playing it at the end of the day. Maybe I was just not getting a grasp for the handling, but I did feel as if it was a case of the races were almost a means of getting to the next part of the game or improving my car. There were very few times where on the track I was thinking, wow, this is a fantastic racing experience. But for the full package that Racing Lagoon's trying to offer, I do think it's a case where it's actually surprising how much fun it is to drive on the track, because we've seen games before that maybe try and do something a bit different off the track, and then the on the track product suffers as a result. But here, like, it is perfectly playable and fun when you've got to do these tracks, if they are maybe a bit too basic in designs, to be honest. It's one of these types of game where a lot of the tracks just feel like kind of slight variations on each other, where the general structure of the track is the same, but maybe instead of a kind of curved corner, it's more of a right-hander, that type of thing. It feels like a lot of the tracks are slightly different ovals or so. That's what I was feeling anyway.
They feel kind of like they're sort of like track editor tracks. Like if a game had a feature like that, which it obviously doesn't, but if it did, they're the kinds of things that you could design yourself, and then the game would automatically populate with like random, trackside objects and stuff next to it. In like a V-Rally 3 kind of way, where like the game only ever models the ribbon of road you're on, and then all of these items to the side are sort of ancillary. There's like one or two tracks. I know there's one where like it's like it's like maybe one of the only tracks like this in the game, but it's very like Snake-like, and how there's like kind of switchbacks and you're going through a town. The road gets very narrow. There's a lot of elevation change. And that's maybe like the only track in the game where I felt like this is bringing something different to the table. Everything else is just kind of 90-degree corners and stuff. And again, I won't begrudge them too much because they weren't trying to make a straight racing game with this game. And if I'm a champion of anything when it comes to this stuff, it's like, I think racing games can be good even if they get the racing wrong. And I think Racing Lagoon is kind of emblematic of that. It's funny because I do get the sense that a lot of effort went into the physics. The physics don't feel perfect, but I think if you were to actually go back and compare this to the contemporaries, you have to remember, like, Gran Turismo and R4 were and Sega Rally were exceptions to the rule. A lot of racing games just handled in weird and nonsensical ways, like Need for Speed 2, for example, or there was a lot of stuff out there that just did not make sense. And I can still wrap my head around the handling in this game. Play it just fine with the D-pad. The closest thing I could compare it to is it kind of feels like one of the grip cars in R4, where you go, it's smooth, but at the same time, sometimes the car will be over responsive and at low speeds it'll be under responsive, and that will lead you into, just as you were saying, Brendan, just kind of smacking into the walls when you thought you gave just the exact amount of pressure, the exact amount of steering input. And suddenly your car's careening, and you're like, I did not see that coming.
Yeah. I mean, I've been, for some reason, recently returning to MRC again. And funnily enough, there were times when, depending on what type of car I was using in terms of the chassis and stuff, I could definitely feel that same way in that game, where when you come to those kind of switchback corners and stuff, you're almost kind of, it's like a Jesus take the wheel moment where you're hoping that you've kind of guided the car enough to get through the corners, but you feel as if you're kind of overdoing it with the turning angle and stuff, it can be difficult. And I'm a massive advocate for D-pad racing games, as you know, Adam, so I was very happy to see that it was a kind of D-pad developed racing game, because obviously you can't use the analog stick at all, can you?
I don't think you can. I was trying to play the game with DualShock, turned on the emulator, and I couldn't. So that's interesting, because it's from 99. Maybe it was the kind of case, and I am completely spitballing here. I'm sure someone who's an expert on this game is listening and would be able to speak to it. But maybe it supported the dual analog controller that was a thing for 2 seconds, and then they replaced it with a DualShock. I don't really know, but analog control, I think, would kind of help this game. But as a kid, D-pad, I was able to make perfect sense of the D-pad, and now it's actually kind of hard for me to go back to games that are just D-pad based. So it's just depending on what you're used to.
I think it's one of these games as well where the D-pad controls are more like, the longer you hold the direction, it feels like you're moving the wheel. As daft as that sounds, as opposed to where some racing games where it's D-pad controlled, it's like you get the same amount of turn in regardless of how long you hold it. It's definitely more in that line, so that probably explains why a lot of the time going around those longer corners, it can feel as if you're just kind of edging on caution.
You're kind of tightening the radius. A game that really kills me with that is Manix TT on the Saturn. Is a lot of the bikes. I actually have to pick a bike that sucks in the handling department in that game, because otherwise it just turns too much, and the initial turn-in's fine, and then if you keep it pressed down for just a fraction of a second too long, all of a sudden you're going perpendicular to the direction you were previously moving in. It can be tough, but it's fine for what Racing Lagoon is, and it's definitely sufficient. And I just, I feel like we've spoken to most of the things that we wanted to call out about this game, and I just can't say enough. If you're pining for new experiences, this is a case of an old one that was actually really... To say it's ahead of its time is almost wrong, because it's not like this foreshadowed anything, but just I wish it was ahead of its time. I wish that the experiments that were taken in this game's development actually produced something down the line that was just think of the world. I have this thought with R4 all the time. Think of the world that could have been created on the PS2. With a game like this. Think of the richer. A version of Racing Lagoon with a richer racing element, that would have been possible on better hardware. a longer development cycle as, you know, the Final Fantasy games enjoyed. Like, think of a game like this that got the proper attention that a sequel would have if this one performed well, and it's just kind of heartbreaking in a way.
It's a tale as old as time at this point when it comes to the racing genre. Anytime we talk about these type of racing games, we very rarely say, and this led to a boom of industry where everybody was making these types of games. Sadly, we don't often get that. And what's interesting about Racing Lagoon, I suppose, is, and I don't know all the intricacies about how licensing has changed for racing games since Racing Lagoon came out and where we are now, but there's like pretty much nothing that would stop this game ever getting a re-release, is there, aside from Square actually acknowledging its existence and doing it? Like, I think it's just a case of they've obviously just decided to leave it to the kind of history books and never look back, but that's a bit of a shame in itself because it's a game that's still absolutely playable in its current state, and as evidenced by the fantastic work done by Hilltop Works and his team. It's what you're looking at here is an experience that requires no buy-in from anybody who wants to play it in terms of cost. It doesn't even require that much effort to get a hold of and play. So if we often say at the end of these podcasts when we talk about games like MRC and the likes that, oh yeah, source it and give it a go. But absolutely for this one, not only just to experience a racing game that was just previously inaccessible pretty much unless you knew Japanese, but just to also show good respect and like basically applaud what Hilltop Works and his team have managed to accomplish here, because these are the types of racing experiences that we want to see more of, and we want to see these risks taken. And who would have thought that in 2021 the most abundant example of that would have been a game from 1999?
Yeah, exactly. I'll definitely make a point to include, it's hard to do links with like the podcast descriptions and stuff like that, but Hilltop has a Patreon where he wants to do more of this sort of thing, and the team, it's there are a number of names in the team, so I feel bad we're not going through everybody, but this was really a group effort, and we'll provide a link to that at least on Twitter, and speak to that in the description when we actually publish this episode. But it is, I am so thankful to everybody involved with this for making this possible, because yeah, exactly, who would have thought that one of my favorite gaming experiences of the year was something this old, this sort of diamond in the rough that like has just never really for a load of reasons has not been able to get the global appreciation and understanding that it has. And to me, it's not one of those games, it's not like a weird curious oddity, it's not the type of thing that's like, oh, it's interesting to see what this could have been, or like some like sort of wacky ideas that just never got picked up or dealt with again. I think it legitimately is an exciting game. It's the kind of thing where I feel one of my hot takes over the years is that like I enjoyed Need for Speed Heat more than I enjoyed Forza Horizon 4. And I feel like this game is almost a similar thing in as much as like, yeah, there are a lot of things objectively like not wrong with it or things that don't really hold up to today's standards. But if you just kind of really take a look at like what it's trying to do, the world it tries to build, and the mechanisms, the JRPG mechanisms and stuff, and how it tries to get there, it's just so much more interesting than just about any racing game that has come out in recent years. I do fully believe that. Like, we didn't even talk about, and I don't fully understand it because I'm still kind of experimenting with it, but there's a whole like banking aspect to this game. I don't know if you
Yeah.
checked that out, Brendan, but because you have like the two currencies, you have the RP and you have, just yen, you can actually convert one to the other, and the yen is what you would use to like buy parts at, the tune shop or something like that, or buy a car at a dealership, which is something you can also do in this game, though you never have to. You're never required to do that. But you can like take these bets where you're like, oh, if you go through this bank, you can invest like you can put like 10,000 RP in this bank, and if you never lose a race, you'll get like a 2 times or a 3 times return on your investment. And then they kind of go into these like percentages as how the interest works and stuff like that. And I've never had a very good financial mind, so I'm just like, this is like so much more than anything I would expect from a racing game. It really is just kind of one of those like weird like off to the left like experimental ideas where it's like, hey, if you want to just try like betting on yourself, I think there's an option where you can like invest in this mythical car that the bank is like backing, and you're like, well, the car may perform well or it may not, so you may just like throw your money at this thing and you may get it all back and then some, or you may just lose everything. Like, it's just there, you can find so many different ways to waste your time in this game. It's really incredible.
Yeah, and that like whole element about the bank feels like a very kind of Japanese game design type thing as well, where there's this random concept thrown in that could probably be its own fucking simulation game in its own right, in terms of the level of depth it has and comparatively to what the experience is trying to offer. And I'll be honest, it's not something I've really touched either, and that kind of sums up, I suppose, that we can talk about this game for an hour, but there's just so much content in here, and the gameplay itself just has many different layers, and you can really make this experience your own pretty much, which is what's exciting about it. There's obviously a linear story in here, but the means of getting to the end of it, it has everything you could want to make it a more customizable experience, in the sense that the get reward system makes that your car probably not very comparable to what other people are using. You can kind of dabble in this bank stuff as well. I'm not doubting as well, I'm betting there's some like really special random encounter cars that you can probably find, if I was to hazard a guess. I haven't seen any myself yet, but that seems like a bit of an open goal to have a few of those in there. So yeah. I suppose you could also just farm random encounters as well for hours on end to see what appears.
It does a TXR thing where you think that every car in the game is just some kind of JDM, what you would expect. Then all of a sudden, like, a Camaro will show up or like a 911 will show up. They seem to be more late game cars, but like these things do exist in the world. So just little surprises like that. I don't even know if they fully realized how much of a surprise it would be to see a car like that in a game like this. There's even like a Beetle. Like just an old Volkswagen Beetle. Yeah, so there's a Testarossa too. Wow, yeah, it's got a very interesting car lineup. The one thing I sort of wanted to actually open the episode with, but I'll kind of close it out because it all kind of is the same in the end anyway, is that there are a number of, there are two like key people who worked on this game. They're actually still at Square to this day. It's still work on games at Square Enix. The producer, a man by the name of Akitoshi Kawazu, he has in later years will become the director of the Saga series, and his most recent game that he produced was the Legend of Mana that came out this year. The scenario writer, Motomo Toriyama, has written for Final Fantasy. He wrote for 13 and the 7 remake. So, the people who were sort of the founding minds behind Racing Lagoon, still at Square Enix, in spite of the fact that they don't really, bring the game up all that much anymore. And you'll appreciate this if you like Squaresoft's other racing game that's a lot more terrible, the illustrious Driving Emotion Type S. But you'll be pleased to know that there was some crossover in terms of the personnel there too. Mostly a lot of the car modelers and the track designers. There was some crossover between the people who worked on Racing Lagoon and those folks who also did the same stuff for Type S at Escape, which was the name of that developer. So, the names kind of go around. There's not a ton of history about this out there, which is actually kind of sad. I would think that a project like this would, and especially all the attention that Square games get, you would think that there would be a little bit more floating out there in terms of like an oral history about Racing Lagoon. But at this point, I really think it is, the fan translators, like it's their story to write almost at this point. Like anything I look up about this game is just about the effort around that, honestly, more than especially because it just happened, as opposed to like the development or any of the history of it.
Yeah, exactly. And we kind of touched on the soundtrack earlier as well, and one of the names that were kind of a good contributor to the soundtrack is Takahito Iguchi, I believe is how you pronounce it. And I found that really interesting because they've actually contributed quite heavily to the Sonic the Hedgehog series over the kind of modern years, but one particular title caught my eye, and it's Rhythm Thief and the Emperor's Treasure, which was a Sega rhythm game that came out on the 3DS. And the soundtrack is very electric and jazz inspired, which of course kind of ties in with the type of audio in this game. And it just really interested me because that game I felt had a very unique soundtrack, and it always kind of captured and caught me by surprise when I played it at the time. And yeah, it's pretty interesting to see that the same kind of subgenres are utilised between both Racing Lagoon and that game. Don't get me wrong, they're not directly comparable by any means, but there's definitely a kind of a similar soundscape you can see in there. So it's, like you're saying, it's pretty interesting just seeing where some of the people who worked on this game ended up in industry. And as always, we have to do our call outs from a soundtrack point of view.
Definitely. The Machine Complete song, which I've put in Time Extend before, when you play this game, you'll hear it at the end of every race, is really like one of the best video game songs I think ever. It's very short, but oh my god, it's such a vibe. It's absolutely gorgeous. And this game has a humongous soundtrack. It's like 60 songs. Mostly done by Noriko Matsueda, and then I think Iguchi handled like the production of it. Yeah. So it was really a two-man effort. And the idea of like two people producing this much music, because even if you look at like a Ridge Racer soundtrack, there's usually like a collection of like 8 artists who will all share work between maybe like 12 songs. This game is just mind-blowing, the output that they got and the consistent quality of it through and through. If you don't play Racing Lagoon and you haven't heard the soundtrack, definitely make sure you at least do that. That is a order to everyone who is listening who is not already doing so.
Just put like an entire non-stop mix of the soundtrack at the end of this pod. It's like then you can't get out of it.
I might do that. But yeah, I think that is just about the best way that we could sum up this game. If we were going to make our typical Time Extend, hour and 10-minute pitch to anyone to play Racing Lagoon, I think this is the only way you can really talk about it without getting into all of the particulars that, the other mechanics in the game, the story, the weirdness of the story, because you could really talk about it forever. Even though it's not that long in terms of playtime, like only, just a matter of hours, it's just because of what it represents and just the fact that it exists at all. I feel like you could take way more time just trying to unpack the game and what everything means to talk about it, as opposed to just like playing it straight through.
Yeah, exactly. And I feel like we say this for every game pretty much nowadays, but this is very much a kind of part of the time extend stable of games that tick all our boxes and try and offer something that you just can't get anywhere else. And we're always going to call that out. That's the thing. As soon as this fan translation was released in full, pretty surprisingly, actually, given that it'd only been 6 months since that first prologue had been done, it was one that we immediately had on our radar, and in kind of classic fashion for us, we did want to get our teeth into it first before diving straight in, which has worked out well because we've been able to have these in-depth chats. And at this point, I think it's fair to say that we can talk about this game, but in terms of doing it justice, you really do have to try and experience it yourself, because it's just so wonderfully 90s, but also fresh, because we've never actually had the chance to see much of this game at all, unless you've kind of consumed videos of the Japanese version on YouTube. So it's great being able to go in blind to a game like this, because it's just a scenario we don't really have that much with racing games, to be honest. I mean, personally, the next one I'm hoping for is for Sega Rally 2006 to get an English translation for that fucking career mode, because that's another example where you just couldn't get the full experience unless you had a clue what it was talking about, and Racing Lagoon was obviously in that camp. So for now, Racing Lagoon is fantastic in the sense that we have that English kind of experience that we can enjoy now, and who knows, maybe that's another one down the line that will get addressed.
Yeah, I remember when we started the Time Extend Discord, and Chris, as I mentioned earlier, was one of the early people to join. He's been a great member and a great moderator, and I feel like I remember him or maybe somebody else saying Racing Lagoon, what a miracle it would be if that ever got translated. What a miracle it would be if we could ever actually play that game, but it'll never ever happen in a million years. And here we are, 2 years later, and we can all play it, and it's really an amazing job that the team did, and I'm so thankful to them for doing it, because it's, I think I basically said as much the other day on Twitter, but it's it's like I've discovered a beloved classic that, in one sense, I feel like I always, it's just so nostalgic playing this game, even though I have no nostalgia for it. It's like this weird deja vu. And it's like I'm almost being reunited with a classic from my childhood, even though I was never able to actually play it in the first place. So, I think we can say it over and over again, but go check it out, and thank you to everybody involved with that effort.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, can't say thanks enough on that regard, and rightfully so. It seems to be getting traction that this translation has went out there, so it's great to see that as well. Lots of
people outside the racing game circles or whatever, people outside of that kind of Twitter sphere, lots of just, I think JRPG fans, weird Japanese games, Squaresoft fans, everybody's kind of finding their way to it for the first time, which is really, really exciting to see. It's actually not too dissimilar from the phenomenon with Forza Horizon, especially with FH5, just how everybody's playing this game. So yeah, it's one of those rare surprises, when M2 redid Virtua Racing for the Switch. It's that thing that I never saw coming, and now that it's made my year. So yeah, and with that said, just typical conclusion, I guess. Thanks everybody for listening. We put on I think you put in the bio, Brendan, which was a good idea on Twitter, but if you come across us on Twitter, DM us for an invite to Discord if you want in on that party. It's a great place to be. A number of the people, like Sid, like Chris, who worked on the Racing Lagoon translation, are actually frequent. You'll definitely see Chris around. Obviously, he's a moderator, but you'll see these names pop in and out, which is really cool. Just great, creators within our community, just kind of popping in, and to be able to hear from a primary source about this game is really, really, not necessarily primary source, but someone who seriously sunk their teeth into it, got their hands into the code and everything about the game, is always one of the coolest things about that Discord, that I'm very, very glad that has unfolded the way it has. It's a fun place to be.
Yeah, absolutely. I often forget how many creators and stuff are actually there, because it's got to this point now where if some people are talking about a specific subject, I'm always half expecting whoever might be involved in that subject to just randomly pop in and add some insight, because it's happened quite a few times now, and it's great because obviously as the community grows and more people get involved in conversation, they kind of go through that experience as well, where they'll be talking about Sega Rally Revo or Colin McRae Rally or one of these type of fan translations and stuff, and then you can get like kind of information almost from the horse's mouth. Nothing incredibly groundbreaking in terms of like it being risky to talk about, but just little tidbits here and there that are just great to see being shared. And yeah, as you've just said, Adam, and we always say, arguably the Discord is the kind of the greatest achievement thus far in terms of where the outreach of the pod has went.
Yeah, so definitely go join us there. Twitter is time_extend for more on that. And yeah, I think that just about wraps it up. So everybody, thanks for listening, and you'll hear from us again soon.
Thanks for listening, guys.